The fluorescent lights buzzed. Renee Coleman's hands shook around a slip of paper worth more than she'd earn in 3 lifetimes. $10 million. Signed with a name she knew the second she saw it. The teller's face went pale. Then hard. Then suspicious, all in 10 seconds. "Ma'am, step aside." His voice dropped into that careful, rehearsed tone people use when they think they're talking to a criminal. Every eye in the bank turned. The security guard near the door shifted, hand already near his radio. Renee's stomach dropped. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not here. Not in front of everyone. 3 miles away, her son lay hooked to machines that beeped louder than her own heartbeat. She had less than 6 hours to prove the paper in her hand wasn't a lie. If you're watching this from your car during a break, from your couch after a long shift, or from bed because sleep won't come easy tonight, comment below and let us know where in the world you're watching from. And if stories like this keep you glued to the screen, hit subscribe, because what happens next will change everything you think you know about second chances. 3 days earlier, Renee Coleman had been folding towels in the laundry room of the Whitmore estate, the kind of grand old house that smelled like lemon polish and old money. She was 51 years old, widowed for 6 years, and tired in the specific way that comes from carrying too much for too long. Her son, Malik, was 22 and fighting a rare blood disorder that the insurance company kept finding new reasons not to fully cover. Renee had worked as a housekeeper for the Whitmore family for almost 11 years, ever since her husband's construction accident left her needing steady work and flexible hours. She wasn't the kind of woman anyone noticed. She moved quietly through hallways, dusted portraits of people who had been dead for decades, and never asked questions about the family she served. But everyone in that house had secrets, and the biggest one belonged to old Gerald Whitmore, the family patriarch, who had been confined to the East Wing for the last 2 years after a stroke robbed him of most of his speech. Renee was the only one who still spoke to him like he was a person and not a burden. She read him the newspaper in the mornings. She held his hand when the physical therapist made him cry from the pain of trying to move fingers that no longer listened. She never told anyone in the family that sometimes, late at night, Gerald would grip her wrist with surprising strength and try to say something, his eyes wide and desperate, like a man drowning in his own body. Renee didn't know that Gerald Whitmore had once been worth $400 million. She didn't know that his son, Preston Whitmore, the sharp-suited man who ran the family's investment firm and who Renee had spoken to maybe a dozen times in 11 years, had spent the last 2 years quietly maneuvering to have his father declared mentally incompetent so he could seize control of the company before the old man's actual will could be executed. She didn't know any of this. All she knew was that Gerald liked when she hummed old gospel songs while she worked, and that his eyes softened whenever she called him Mr. Gerald instead of Sir, the way the rest of the staff did. On a Tuesday afternoon that would later feel like the hinge on which her entire life turned, Gerald grabbed her wrist harder than usual. His mouth worked, straining, and for the first time in 8 months, actual words came out, cracked and slurred but unmistakable. "Notebook," he said. "Drawer. Yours." Renee frowned, glancing toward the nightstand. Inside the drawer was a small leather notebook, the kind old men used to carry receipts and phone numbers in before cell phones existed. She almost put it back, unsure if this was a moment of clarity or confusion. But something in his eyes, a pleading, an urgency, made her tuck it into her apron pocket instead. She didn't open it until she got home that night, and when she did, her hands went cold. Inside was a handwritten letter, dated 18 months earlier, in Gerald Whitmore's shaking but legible script. It named her Renee Coleman. It said that in the event of his death or incapacitation, $10 million from a private trust, separate from the company, separate from anything Preston could touch, was to be released to her, no conditions, no explanations required. At the bottom was a phone number for a man named Arthur Kessler, an estate attorney Renee had never heard of. She read it 4 times before she let herself believe it was real. Then she read it a 5th time and started to cry, not from joy, but from fear. Because if this was real, someone in that family was going to be furious that she knew. Please, if this story is stirring something in you, drop a comment and share what you'd do if you were in Renee's shoes. And if you believe kindness always finds its way back to us eventually, tap that like button before we go further, because what Renee didn't know yet was that the real danger hadn't even started. She called the number the next morning from the break room, her voice shaking as she introduced herself. Arthur Kessler didn't sound surprised at all. In fact, he sounded relieved. "I've been trying to reach you for 2 weeks," he said. "Preston has blocked every letter I've attempted to send to the house. Miss Coleman, I need you to come to my office as soon as possible. There isn't much time." Renee didn't understand what he meant by that, not fully, not yet. She asked for a few days, explaining that her son had just been readmitted to the hospital for a treatment that couldn't wait, and Kessler's voice grew quieter, more serious. "Miss Coleman, listen to me carefully. Gerald Whitmore's condition is being used right now, today, to petition the court for full conservatorship. Once that petition is granted, Preston will control everything, including the trust meant for you. The check I'm prepared to issue will become worthless paper unless it's cashed before that hearing." Renee sat in her car in the hospital parking lot that night, staring through the windshield at nothing, her son sleeping upstairs with tubes running into his thin arm, and she made a decision that terrified her. She would go get that check. She would try to cash it. And she would pray that somehow, some way, the world would let a woman like her win just once. The bank did not let her win. Not at first. Standing there under those fluorescent lights, with a security guard's hand hovering near his radio, Renee felt something break open inside her chest, not despair exactly, but a kind of righteous exhaustion. The feeling of a woman who has spent her entire life being doubted and was simply, finally, done being quiet about it. "That check is real," she said, louder than she meant to. "I don't care how it looks. I don't care what you think a woman like me is supposed to be carrying around. That check is real, and I am not leaving this bank without answers." The branch manager, a stiff woman named Deborah Ashford, stepped out of her office at the sound of raised voices, arms crossed, already skeptical. "Ma'am, $10 million checks from private family trusts don't typically show up with cleaning staff," she said, and the words landed like a slap, exactly as they were meant to. Renee felt heat rush to her face. She thought of Malik in that hospital bed. She thought of Gerald Whitmore's trembling hand gripping her wrist. She thought of 11 years of scrubbing floors that weren't hers, in a house that was never going to be hers, for people who mostly never learned her name. "Call the number on the back of that letter," she said, sliding Kessler's card across the counter with a hand that would not stop shaking. "Call him right now, or call the police, I don't care which, but somebody in this bank better start taking me seriously before my son runs out of time." It was in that exact moment, with security beginning to move toward her, that the glass doors of the bank swung open and a man in a charcoal suit walked in like he owned the air itself. Renee's stomach dropped for an entirely different reason. It was Preston Whitmore. For a horrifying second, she assumed the worst, that he had come to finish what his silence had started, to have her arrested, to erase the inconvenience she had become. Deborah Ashford's posture immediately straightened, recognizing money and power when she saw it. "Mr. Whitmore, is there a problem?" she asked, practically falling over herself. Preston didn't even look at her. His eyes were locked on Renee, and something complicated moved behind them, not anger, not exactly, but something closer to shame wrestling with fear. "There's no problem," he said slowly. "Except that you're all about to make a very expensive mistake." The room went silent. Renee held her breath, unsure whether she was about to be saved or destroyed. "That check is real," Preston continued, stepping forward, pulling a folded document from his jacket. "It's backed by an irrevocable trust my father established 18 months ago, and I would know, because I spent the last several weeks trying to have it invalidated." He said this last part without flinching, without softening it, and Renee realized with a jolt that he wasn't defending her out of kindness. He was confessing. If your heart is racing right now the way ours is, take a second and comment your honest reaction. Do you think Preston came to help her or to protect himself? Like this video if you're desperate to know what happens next, because the truth Preston was about to reveal would break this story wide open. 2 days ago, My father's court hearing for conservatorship was thrown out, Preston said, his voice tightening as he forced the words through what looked like genuine difficulty. The judge reviewed medical evaluations I paid 3 specialists to falsify, and when those evaluations were compared against his actual neurological records, obtained independently by Mr. Kessler, the fraud became obvious. I am currently under investigation. My legal team advised me to disappear for a while. Instead, I'm standing in this bank, telling a room full of strangers that everything I did was wrong, because somewhere along the way I stopped being able to look at my own father without seeing dollar signs. And that woman, he pointed at Renee, his hand unsteady. That woman saw a human being. Every single day. While I saw an obstacle. Deborah Ashford looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. The security guard slowly lowered his hand from his radio. Renee stood frozen, tears building behind her eyes that she refused to let fall in front of these people. My father recorded something, Preston continued, quieter now. Before the stroke fully took his speech, he made a video. My lawyers found it locked in a safe deposit box 2 days ago, one I didn't even know existed. He talks about you, Ms. Coleman. He talks about the nights you sat with him when none of us would. He says, Preston's voice cracked, and for a moment the polished executive vanished, replaced by a son confronting the size of his own failure. He says you were the only person who never once asked him for anything. And that's exactly why he wanted you to have everything. Renee finally let herself cry, right there in the middle of the bank lobby, in front of a security guard and a horrified branch manager, and the man who had spent weeks trying to erase her existence from his father's will. It wasn't relief exactly. It was grief, tangled up with something like vindication, tangled up with the bone-deep exhaustion of a woman who had spent so long being told her worth was measured by what she could scrub clean. I don't want your guilt, she finally said to Preston, wiping her face with the back of her hand. I want my son to live. That's all I have ever wanted. Everything else is just noise. Preston nodded slowly, and for the first time, something like respect crossed his face. He turned to Deborah Ashford. Clear the check. Today. Immediately. If there is a single delay, I promise you, the fraud investigation currently circling my name will look like nothing compared to what happens to this branch. Within an hour, Renee Coleman was standing outside the hospital, her phone in hand, staring at a bank confirmation notice that still didn't feel entirely real. $10 million. Enough to cover every treatment Malik would ever need. Enough to move out of the cramped apartment where the heater rattled all winter. Enough, finally, to stop being afraid every single time the phone rang with an unfamiliar number, certain it was another collections agency or another doctor delivering news she couldn't afford to hear. But the moment that actually broke her, the moment she would replay for the rest of her life, came 2 days later when she visited Gerald Whitmore in the private care facility his family had finally, properly arranged for him. His speech was still slow, still labored, but his eyes were sharp, present, grateful. Renee sat beside his bed the way she always had, and this time, instead of humming an old gospel song, she simply held his hand and let the silence say everything words couldn't. Why me? She finally asked him. Out of everyone. Why did you choose me? Gerald's mouth curved into something like a smile, uneven but unmistakably warm. It took him almost a full minute to form the words, each one costing him visible effort. Because, he said, you never wanted anything from me. Except for me to still be a person. If this moment moved you even a little, comment below and share it, because there is a good chance someone in your life needs to hear that kindness is never actually wasted, even when it feels invisible, even when no one is watching, even when you think nobody will ever notice or repay it. In the weeks that followed, Renee Coleman did not disappear into luxury the way people might expect. She paid off Malik's medical debt in full within the first week, then sat with him at his bedside as doctors finally began a treatment plan they had previously deemed too expensive to pursue. She quietly resigned from the Whitmore household, not out of anger, but because Gerald himself insisted she deserved a life that wasn't built around someone else's laundry. Preston Whitmore, facing his own legal reckoning, publicly acknowledged what he had attempted to do, a confession that cost him his position at the family firm but seemed, in some strange way, to lift a weight he'd been carrying since long before Renee ever entered the picture. Some people believed his apology. Others didn't. Renee chose, for her own sake, to let that judgment belong to someone else. She used a portion of the money to start a small fund for caregivers, home health aides, hospice workers, housekeepers, people who spent their lives tending to the forgotten and the fading, often for wages that barely covered rent. She named it simply, the Gerald Fund. It wasn't about being remembered as generous. It was about making sure the next Renee Coleman, wherever she was, wouldn't have to stand in a bank lobby being accused of lying about the truth of her own worth. Malik recovered slowly, then steadily, and eventually well enough to walk his mother down the aisle at a wedding 2 years later that neither of them could have imagined affording before. Gerald Whitmore lived another year and a half, long enough to attend that wedding in a wheelchair, long enough to watch Renee laugh in a way he told her, in his slow, careful speech, he had been waiting years to see. Before we close this story out, we want to hear from you. Subscribe if stories about quiet kindness finding its reward means something to you. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that decency is never invisible. And comment the biggest lesson you're walking away with tonight. Years later, when people asked Renee how her life had changed so completely in the span of a single afternoon, she never talked about the number on the check. She talked instead about an old man's trembling hand around her wrist, about a notebook hidden in a drawer, about the difference between being seen and simply being useful. She would tell them that the world rarely announces the moments that matter most. Sometimes it just leaves a slip of paper in a drawer and waits patiently to see who is kind enough and patient enough to notice.